Next, we have a presentation or a paper by David and Joanne Seeley. Joanne Seeley has a BA in Communications and an MA in Anthropology with a focus in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from BYU. She's taught in the program on Studies in Religion at the University of Michigan, at the BYU Jerusalem Center for Near Eastern Studies, and at BYU, where she, along with her husband David, were awarded Honors Professor of the Year. David Seeley received a BA in Classical Greek and an MA in Classics from BYU, as well as a master's and a doctoral degree in Ancient and Biblical Studies from the University of Michigan. Professor Seeley joined the faculty at BYU in 1987, and he was an assistant editor and contributor to the Anchor Bible Dictionary and a member of the international team of scholars that translated the Dead Sea Scrolls. Appropriately, David met his wife Joanne while working together in the archives at BYU's library. So, Seeley's.
The test of Abraham and Sarah. Look into Abraham your father and unto Sarah that bare you. In the biblical tradition, Abraham and Sarah through covenant are the literal and spiritual father and mother of Israel and the nations. That means there are spiritual mother and father. In Genesis 17, when the Lord changed their names, he promised Abram, "Thou shalt be a father of many nations." To Sarai, he promised, "I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her." Indeed, the covenant is established through Abraham and Sarah and their family, and it is through their family that the plan of salvation or happiness will be realized. The family of the seed of Abraham and Sarah will be joined by all that accept Christ to be accounted as their seed. We read in the book of Abraham, and this has been quoted at least twice before today, "I will bless them through thy name, for as many as receive this gospel shall be called after thy name, and shall be accounted thy seed, and shall rise up and bless thee as their father." In Isaiah's grand vision of the future, he sees the growth of Abraham and Sarah's covenant family symbolized by their family tent that needed to be expanded. The Lord, through Isaiah, admonished Israel to look to Abraham and Sarah both as evidence of the power of God to deliver Israel and as role models. Look unto Abraham your father and unto Sarah that bare you. The stories in the Abrahamic narratives relate how God, through his grace and power, tests Abraham and Sarah and illustrates how they respond and grow. These stories present Abraham and Sarah as role models and invite us, the readers, to learn the covenantal virtues from their experiences. And today I'm going to do the tests of Abraham, and Joanne will do the tests of Sarah. 10 tests of Abraham. Early biblical commentators identified various stories in which Abraham was tested, and they identified in the Abrahamic narratives 10 specific episodes that they designated the 10 tests of Abraham. Interestingly enough, his approach is foreshadowed by a statement in the book of Abraham. In Abraham's vision of the creation, the Lord explained to Abraham that the purpose of the creation was to provide a place where the Lord could test his children. And prove them therewith to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. It is likely that this approach to reading the Abrahamic stories of the 10 tests was inspired by the introduction to the story of the Lord commanding Abraham in chapter 22, where test or try is used, the Hebrew verb nasah, and the Lord tested Abraham. Elsewhere in the Bible, this verb is used to refer to the Lord testing individuals, and especially in testing Israel, to determine their character in the face of trials and adversity. The earliest mentions of the 10 tests of Abraham are found in the book of Jubilees, 2nd century BC. Speaking of the burial of Sarah, Jubilees recounts, this is the 10th trial with which Abraham was tried. This same approach is also mentioned in the Messianic tractate Avot, 2nd century AD, With 10 temptations was Abraham our father tempted, and he stood steadfast in them all to show how great was the love of God our Father. Through time, in rabbinic literature, there developed many different lists of the 10 tests. Almost always the test of sacrifice of Isaac is seen as the climactic and final test. Rashi, in the 11th century, in his commentary on the Avot, lists and enumerates his choices for the 10 tests. And you'll notice the first one is Abraham hid from Nimrod. The second one is Nimrod cast him into the blazing furnace. Two episodes that are not found in the biblical text, but are found in Midrashic literature. We've actually talked about those both in our conference this morning. These kinds of stories echo the kind of religious persecution that Abraham experienced in the book of Abraham. You'll see that the last test here is God commanded him to sacrifice his son Isaac. Later, Maimonides also established the 10 tests and gave a similar list with all of these episodes occurring in the Hebrew Bible. His list begins with leave the homeland to be a stranger in Canaan, and it ends with God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. The Abrahamic stories in Genesis 12 through 25 thus contain various episodes in which we can identify various tests and trials. We can identify through these stories the strength and weaknesses of Abraham and Sarah as they deal with situations and challenges in their lives. Throughout these stories, the Lord reveals the promises and blessings of the Abrahamic covenant. In Genesis 12 through 25, scholars have identified about 20 episodes, but not all of these are stories of Abraham. Scholars such as Cassuto and Rendsburg, which we'll hear from later, have argued that these episodes can be arranged in sets of 10 with chiastic parallelism between the chiastic pairs. For the sake of reading these stories today, though, we've decided to pick our 12. And so we have the 12 tests of Abraham, and Joanne has her 12 tests of Sarai. You'll notice that 5 of these are addressed with Abram and Sarai, and 5 of these are addressed to Abraham and Sarah. And we're not, there are chiastic parallel pairs here, but we're not arranging them as a chiasm here. We just have established these episodes. And you'll notice that it begins with Abraham called to leave his home, and it ends with the binding of Isaac. So we're going to talk about each one of these tests. Test number 1, Abraham and Sarah were called to leave their home. Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show unto thee. Here Abraham is told to leave his homeland and his family, to go to an unknown land that the Lord would show him. In conjunction with this commandment, the Lord began to give Abraham the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. And the promises of the covenant are interspersed through these trials. As David Colabron showed us, they match, right? Test and promises. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Abram demonstrated his faith in the Lord through obedience, and he took Sarai and Lot and the souls they had gathered and went to Haran and then Canaan as the Lord directed. With this move, Abraham left behind his past and the things that he loved, his home, his homeland, and his family, for the promises of an unknown covenantal future. Second test, Abraham and Sarai are delivered from Pharaoh. After arriving in Canaan, Abraham and Sarai were met by famine. They went to Egypt in order to find food, and there they met another trial. Abraham, fearing for his life, lest Pharaoh kill him, for Sarai, on account of her beauty, devised a plan to deceive Pharaoh. In the book of Abraham, the Lord commanded Abraham to tell Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister. And it came to pass that I, Abraham, told Sarai my wife all that the Lord had said unto me. Therefore say unto them, I pray thee, thou art my sister, and it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. This description saved Abram's life, since Pharaoh, assuming Sarai was not married, took Sarai as a prospective wife. The Lord intervened by sending a plague on Pharaoh and his house, and Sarai and Abraham were delivered from Egypt and returned to Canaan. Third test, conflict with Lot and the division of the land. Upon returning to Canaan, Abraham met another test, resolving conflict in his own family. Lot and his herdmen and Abraham's herdmen found that they could not live together due to the conflict they had. Abraham, though he was the senior leader of the family, assumed the role of the peacemaker. Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee. Abraham allowed Lot to choose the area where he would like to settle. In Abraham 1, verse 2, Abraham declared that he sought to be a prince of peace, a type of Christ. Lot chose what he perceived to be the best and most fertile land in the Rift Valley and went to settle there in Sodom. Little did he know. Abraham and Sarah remained in the less fertile hill country. Fourth test, the rescue of Lot. By choosing the most fertile land, Lot found himself in the middle of an international conflict when 5 kings from Mesopotamia invaded Sodom and captured him and proceeded to take him away from Canaan to Mesopotamia. Abraham, loyal to his family, raised an army and followed the retreating armies, engaged them in combat, and rescued Lot in Dan. In Genesis 13, Abraham is known as a peacemaker. In this story, juxtaposed with peacemaker, he is a warrior and a deliverer and a redeemer. Abraham knew the role of peacemaker and the role of warrior, and he knew when to assume each role. Abraham, as a righteous warrior, boldly stated that he would not take profit from warfare, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine. In rabbinic literature, Abraham said that he would only fight to save lives, but not for booty. On his return to Canaan, Abraham met Melchizedek, the high priest of Salem, who blessed him, gave him priesthood, and shared a meal of bread and wine. Abraham demonstrated his humility and faith by paying his tithing to Melchizedek. The fifth test, the faith of Abraham and the dialogue with God. In a moving dialogue with the Lord, Abraham expressed his concern that although the Lord had promised him posterity and land, so far he had neither. Abraham meekly proposed to adopt his steward as his heir. In response, the Lord reassured Abraham of his intention to fulfill his promise of seed. He promised that Abraham would have a child from his body. He shall come forth out of thine own bowels and shall be thine heir. As a sign and token of this promise, the Lord showed him the heavens. Look now towards heavens and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. Then follows a pivotal passage in the testing of Abraham. The text says that Abraham believed in the Lord, and the Lord counted it to him for righteousness. Here, Abraham has passed the test by declaring his faith, his belief that God would fulfill his promise, and the Lord acknowledged his faith by counting it to Abraham for righteousness. The Lord then commanded Abraham to prepare a sacrifice of animals, which he cut into pieces. And the Lord passed through the pieces as an enactment of the covenant oath ceremony with which the Lord swore that he would fulfill the promise of the land to Abram's posterity in the future. Sixth test, Sarah's sacrificing, offering Hagar to Abram. In the interest of time, we're going to discuss this later. In short, Abraham's test was to listen to his wife, Sarai. You're supposed to laugh. It's a test, right? We're going to soon find out here. Slide 19. Abram took Hagar to wife, and she conceived and bore a son, Ishmael. According to the covenant of his day, his son could legally be considered the firstborn son of Sarai. The seventh test, the enactment of covenant through circumcision. As Abram and Sarai continued to get old, the Lord dramatically again appeared to Abraham and said, I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect. So Abraham, the man of faith, the man of obedience, the man of righteousness, was commanded to be perfect. The Lord continued making the covenant explicitly with Abraham and Sarai by changing their names from Abram, exalted father, to Abraham, father of a multitude, and from Sarai, princess, to Sarah, which also means princess. The Lord promised them that they would be the father and mother of nations and kings. Here, the Lord, for the first time, revealed that the birthright son and the future posterity would come from Sarah. In response, Abraham laughed, whether for joy, doubt, or with humor, or a combination of the three. The Lord commanded Abraham to bear the token of the covenant in his flesh. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. It shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. Abraham demonstrated his obedience, and he circumcised himself and his household on that selfsame day. Eighth test, the divine visitation, hospitality. 3 heavenly messengers were sent to Abraham and Sarah to test if they are willing to extend themselves to strangers coming off the desert. Since the Lord does much of the speaking in this chapter, some commentators believe that one of the messengers was the Lord. Juxtaposed with this story of the exalted promises of fatherhood and motherhood of Israel and the nations, the 3 messengers were sent to test to see if Abraham and Sarah would demonstrate humility by caring for strangers and outsiders. Abraham and Sarah passed the test of hospitality with flying colors. They invited the strangers into their home. A Jewish midrash says that Abraham's tent was always open on all 4 sides so that travelers would know that they were all welcome. Joanne and David run a household where we teach the patriarchal virtues. I'm going to tell you a story in which we effectively taught the virtue of hospitality. Many years ago, a van pulled up in front of our house, which bore a family. You know, the family that you love to pieces and they come and they never leave and they eat all your food, that kind of family, and you love them anyway. David had baked 2 pies that morning, and the 2 pies were sitting on the cupboard, and he looked out the window and he saw the van. Predictably, the matriarch, Joanne, shouted, "Clean the house." And unforgettably, Patriarch David yelled to the children, "Hide the pies." They've never forgotten, and I've never been able to undo those famous words. Nevertheless, we teach patriarchal virtues in our household, often by negative examples. The messengers then delivered the message that Sarah, in her old age, would bear a son. The 9th test, Abraham's intercession for Lot. Lot was delivered and Sodom was destroyed. The Lord, who was perhaps one of the messengers, then informed Abraham that he would send the messengers to test the hospitality of Sodom to see if they were wicked. If so, he intended to destroy the city and to destroy Sodom. Abraham passed the test of the destruction of the righteous among the wicked by interceding with the Lord to save Lot and his family. This is the famous discussion where the Lord and Abraham discuss how many righteous people have to be in the city in order to save it. And as you know, they decided on the number 10, which happens to be the number of people in Lot's family. That is, if the daughters can get their husbands and fiancés to come with them. In the interest of time, we're going to also skip this portion that you can read in our paper if you would like. The 10th test, Abraham and Sarah in Gerar, and they were delivered from Abimelech. This test is similar to Pharaoh in Egypt, and we will deal with this one later. Test 11, the birth of Isaac and the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. The faith of Abraham and Sarah was finally rewarded with the birth of the promised son Isaac. This caused conflict and resulted in the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. Again, in the interest of time, we're going to discuss this episode later. The 12th test, the final test, Abraham binds Isaac. In most lists of the 10 tests, and here the 12th test, the final and climactic test was the Lord commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son. And it came to pass after these things that the Lord did test Abraham. And he said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. This shocking command for Abraham to sacrifice his son was contrary to everything that Abraham knew to be right. And to obey this commandment, Abraham would have to venture into the unknown, in the words of Kierkegaard, to make a leap of faith. The commandment of this final test forms an inclusio with God's opening test in Genesis 12, where the call for Abraham to leave his land and venture to the promised land was stated, the promised land that the Lord would show. In chapter 12:1, we read, Now the Lord said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. So I want you to look at these two passages and see how they resonate with each other. In 12:1, get thee out, Hebrew lech lecha, of thy country unto the land that I will show thee. And in 22:1, get thee into, Hebrew lech lecha, the land of Moriah, which I will tell thee of. Chapter 12 is the first time that the Lord spoke to Abraham, and chapter 22 is the last. Both commands contain the imperative lech lecha, get thee out, the only two usages of this form in the Hebrew Bible. Both journeys involve leaving home and going to a place where the Lord would show, and at the end of both journeys, Abraham would build an altar to offer sacrifice. In this story, Abraham faces the test of faith in his relationship with the Lord. Was this the Lord commanding him to do this? He faced the test of his faith in the covenant and its blessings and promises. He faced the test of obedience to a commandment that he did not understand. And he faced the test of sacrifice. What would he be willing to do to obey God? Abraham chose to obey. One scholar has noted the profound difference between the first test to leave Ur for the promised land and the test to go to Moriah to sacrifice Isaac. In the first test, Abraham is asked to disengage himself from his past. That is, to leave his home and his family and embrace the future promises of the covenant. In the final test, Abraham is asked to abandon his future. That is, to lose all that the Lord had promised him to be fulfilled through his promised son, Isaac. The story is well known. Abraham set off with Isaac to Moriah, the place the Lord would show him. They took wood for the altar to the altar. Isaac asked his father, where was the sacrifice? And Abraham responded, the Lord will provide. Abraham bound his son, laid him on an altar, and raised the knife for the sacrifice. At that dramatic moment, one wonders, who is testing who? Unexpectedly, the Lord intervened and commanded Abraham to not sacrifice Isaac, but he provided a ram in the thicket for the sacrifice. Thus, Abraham, in this test, passed the final excruciating test. And the angel of the Lord called him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. This story is a type of the future sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the seed of Abraham, sent to bless the nations through his atonement, the Lamb of God.
Sarah, Abraham's beloved wife and partner, has a voice, and what a wonderful thing that is in the scriptures. But because the focus of these narratives is on Abraham, we need to read the text curiously and sensitively to try and reconstruct Sarah's role in the stories, to read between the lines a bit. Sarah is a woman of consequence beyond the fact that she was married to the great patriarch Abraham. Following Eve, Sarah is the first woman in the Bible to be directly addressed by God after he promises her a son. Sarah laughed at the thought, and the Lord responded with a rather direct challenge to her. Is anything too hard for the Lord? And when questioned as to why she laughed, she denied it. So her first encounter was a spunky one. She has piqued our interest already. Sarah is a prototype of the great matriarchs in the Bible. They were not merely silent partners, but human beings of great character. Yes, both the sterling type and also what one might call a real character on occasion. They traversed life with strength, intelligence, endurance, and loyalty to family and faith. They were nurturing mothers, albeit conniving on occasion, and were committed to the covenant and to God. The matriarchs were well suited, corresponding to their patriarchal partners in biblical terms. What were their duties? The matriarchs were responsible for providing a home, the center of life in patriarchal times, including the production of food and clothing, and for the education and social development of the family. One must imagine a world with no Walmart or grocery stores. Thinking of providing clothing that began with shearing sheep and spinning and weaving the wool. Bearing, nurturing, and educating children was also the realm of the matriarchs. The biblical family was interdependent. Husband and wife each shouldered a heavy load to provide, care for, nurture, and teach their children. The three great promises of the Abrahamic covenant were given to both Abraham and Sarah, and they will figure starkly in their lives. Each of the promises contain inherent blessing, and yet they entailed a great trial of their faith and hardship as well. We've just discussed the 12 trials of Abraham, and now we are going to take a little twist and consider the 12 trials or tests of Sarah. The list we have here is basically the same with just a little bit of adjustment to discuss Sarah. Due to the time, we'll discuss some of them with a little more details than others. But thinking of these trials through the eyes of Sarah adds depth to her story. It's kind of like the old cartoon about one of the greatest dance couples in film history. People were always saying how great Fred Astaire was. But don't forget that Ginger Rogers did everything he did backwards and on high heels. Lech lecha, go yourself, get yourself out. An imperative from the Lord. Abraham was called by the Lord, and he was told to get up and go and leave home. This is a theme in the scriptures, being called to leave home or the world to follow righteousness. Adam and Eve left the garden. Abram and Sarai leave Ur. Moses and the Israelites leave Egypt. Lehi and his family leave Jerusalem. The pioneers left Nauvoo. Abraham was told to go unto a land that I will show thee. In other words, destination unknown. What does this mean for Sarai? They were a couple, so the call was to both of them. Sarai will have to leave her native land, her home, her family, and she does not even know where they are going or where she will live. She had to organize the household and arrange the food and clothing for the journey, which was no small feat. After a sojourn in Haran, they journeyed to Beersheba, which is about 500 miles by foot or camel. Her home in Mesopotamia had a more sophisticated civilization and with some good-sized cities. Canaan was a backwater, rocky and hilly, and in the south, arid desert. She will be leaving her homeland forever. They will be foreigners among the Canaanites, and she will most likely be living in a tent for the rest of her life. This was an incredible test of faith, the call of God. It was a test of courage and obedience and willingness to do hard things, and she did it. Test number 2 for Sarai begins similarly to test number 1. She was again asked to leave her home due to famine and travels hundreds of miles to Egypt. Abram fears for his life and was instructed by the Lord to ask Sarai to pretend she is his sister in order to preserve his life. Sarai must have also been in great fear for Abram's life, and she goes along with it. But in an interesting reversal, it was actually Sarai's life that was in real danger. She was taken by Pharaoh, presumably with the idea of becoming his wife. Sarai finds herself in a very precarious situation. Based on the norms of women at the time, she was powerless. She must have been terrified, lonely, and full of anxiety about what would happen to her. She is silent in this narrative, perhaps a reflection of her trauma. She was miraculously delivered by the plagues sent by the Lord upon Pharaoh's household and was reunited with her husband Abram. Rabbinic tradition notes that Sarah is a type of the Israelites who would also be released from Egyptian bondage because of plagues that are afflicted on Pharaoh and his household sent by the Lord. Thus, Sarai becomes a model for divine deliverance and utter dependence on the word of the Lord. She has passed the test with her willingness to sacrifice herself on behalf of her husband and her resilience in the face of extreme circumstances. The next 3 tests, Sarai was not present, but she was very much affected by Abram's actions in all 3. In test number 3, the dividing of the land with Lot, Abram offered Lot first choice. And Lot chose the well-watered plain of Jordan, described even as the garden of the Lord. By default, that leaves Sarai and Abram with rocky and barren hill country. No complaint is recorded, and Sarai selflessly carries on with her husband. In number 4, Abraham leaves with his 318 men for battle to rescue Lot. This was a bigger problem for her than I ever thought about before. She was letting Abraham go, realizing the potential for great risk to his well-being and the potential loss of her husband in battle. Sarai was left behind alone and living in a foreign land without Abram, who was absolutely her protection and provider. Following Abram's successful mission to secure Lot, he was found faithfully paying their tithing to Melchizedek, again representing himself both and Sarai, his wife, in their righteous desires. Test number 5. While Sarai is not mentioned in the narrative of sacrificial offerings and covenant making in Genesis chapter 15, she was impacted by it. Abram had been given the promise of great posterity earlier, but in this encounter, God covenanted with him in a formal oath ceremony and gave him specific signs to remind him of the promise. After Abram was denied his request for Eleazar, his steward, to be his heir, he was promised that his heir would come out of his own bowels, and then instructed to look toward heaven. Abram was given the sign that his seed would be as numberless as the stars, but Sarai is not mentioned. The vision of the starry night sky would be a constant reminder of her barrenness and inability as a partner to help Abram see the fulfillment of this promise. Test number 6. Perhaps motivated by the promise in Genesis 15 that a covenant child would come from Abram's own body, Sarai decided to offer her handmaid Hagar to Abram as a wife in order to conceive a son and presumably begin the pathway to fulfillment of the covenant promises. This was an accepted practice at the time, particularly in the case of a barren first wife, and was recognized in D&C 132-34 as fulfilling the promises, at least in part. It was also supported by ancient law codes. But this was more than just a grand gesture on the part of Sarai. For biblical women at the time, their identity was established by family relationships, whose daughter they were, whose wife they were, and whose mother they were. Sarai has already lost 2 of these. Her family was left behind many years ago, and she is infertile and has no children. The only thing she has left in terms of society and family relationships is her identity as the wife of Abram. And far more significant than that was her relationship with Abraham as the central focus in her life. By offering Hagar to Abram, she has offered to assist him in obtaining the blessings of posterity, but by doing so, it will most certainly change forever her relationship with him. I have often thought of this as the sacrifice of Sarah, which precedes the great sacrificial offering Abraham was going to make with his son Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. If considered from the eyes of Sarai, she is making an offering that was likened to what would be asked of Abraham, basically laying herself on the altar. Some would argue that Sarai was merely looking to obtain a son of her own through a surrogate second wife, which she would have been entitled to, but the story ends quite differently. When Hagar became pregnant, Sarah relates that she became despised in her eyes, indicating maltreatment of some sort, and according to the custom and law of the time, Sarai was entitled to deal with this, and she did harshly. Hagar fled, but was visited by an angel with the message that the Lord had heard her affliction. Her unborn son would be named Ishmael, God hears, and he would be the father of a multitude, and Hagar returns to the household of Sarai and Abram. It was only after Sarai has made this great sacrifice in behalf of Abram that the Lord again comes to Abram to renew the covenant promises, and in the process he gave them each a new name and promised Abraham would be the father of many nations, and Sarah would become the mother of nations. The very first indication that Sarah will become a mother. The test here in this chapter seems to be the injunction in verse 1, be thou perfect. I guess that's the ultimate test, and it lasts for a really long time. Number 8. David has spoken about the test of hospitality, highlighted as one of the great virtues of the patriarchs. But notice, when the visitors arrive, Abraham immediately runs into the tent and says to Sarah, make ready, quickly, 3 measures of fine meal. This means grinding the flour, kneading and baking the bread upon the hearth, requiring the fire to be built. 3 measures of meal will make about 2 gallons of dough, enough to make 12 loaves of their bread. Sarah and the matriarchs were a large part of hospitality, and I think they passed the test. The meal was followed by a wonderful exchange. Sarah, who still is in the tent, heard the Lord tell Abraham she will have a son, and because of her age, she laughs within herself. The Lord challenges her. Is anything too hard for the Lord? A great question for all of us. It is echoed by Elizabeth to Mary, both of whom experienced miraculous conceptions when Elizabeth proclaims, for with God nothing shall be impossible. Test number 9 is very similar to test number 2, the interaction with Pharaoh, as Abraham told Abimelech that Sarah was his sister again to protect his life. And this suggests a thematic lesson of God's watch care for us, and especially his protection of both Abraham and Sarah, and later Isaac and Rebekah in a similar story. In this episode, we learn Sarah is Abraham's half-sister with the same father but a different mother, and they both come through fine. Test number 10 is unique to the list for Sarah because we cannot imagine bearing a child in old age, let alone at 90. This was perhaps Sarah's greatest test. It would have been a really hard thing to go through. In the marvelous sermon on the faith of the ancients in the book of Hebrews, it says, through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. She passed the test. Sarah and Abraham manifest another great characteristic of getting through life's trials here, a great sense of humor. They can laugh at life and laugh together. In Genesis 17, Abraham is told by God Sarah will have a son, and Abraham falls on his face and laughs. Imagine his relationship with God. Sarah laughs in the tent when she hears that the Lord tell Abraham that she will have a son and then denies it. Imagine her relationship with God. The Lord joins in when he tells them their son will be named Isaac, meaning he who laughs. But Sarah has the last laugh. When Isaac is born, she says, God hath made me to laugh so that all that hear will laugh with me. Number 11, the grave difficulty with Hagar over the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac is the last test that Sarah will take an active part in. It is a complex story because it involves the status of Sarah and her handmaid Hagar within the household and some difficult family dynamics. The test says that Ishmael was mocking and does not clarify the issue, but it was serious enough that for Sarah to demand that Hagar and Ishmael be cast out, which was her right according to the ancient customs and laws, and it grieved Abraham. The Lord instructs Abraham to hearken, meaning to listen and obey Sarah, and promises Abraham that Hagar and Ishmael will be cared for and will prosper. According to the Code of Hammurabi, which is just a little later, a secondary wife or slave that was sent away with her children would be given her freedom. So perhaps this was part of the process and may have softened the blow of expulsion. Test number 12. In this final and most dramatic of all the tests Sarah and Abraham have, the Akedah or binding of Isaac, Sarah was not present. Rabbinic literature has a number of possible interpretations for this. Perhaps she did not need to be tested and had already passed the test of faith in terms of becoming a mother. Perhaps Abraham did not confide in her. Maybe she was watching from the tent. Was she waiting and worrying for 3 days? Was her voice silent because it was too painful to describe? Her only child, her long-awaited and well-loved son, was taken away to be sacrificed. It is unimaginable. At some point in time, she would know, and this would have been a massive trial of her faith, whether she found out before or after the fact. In recounting the story of the Akedah, or binding of Isaac, we often talk about the types that are present. Abraham as the type of God the Father, Isaac as the type of Christ, Mount Moriah as the place of sacrifice, and so on. Who is Sarah a type of in this narrative? I think that she is a type of Mary, the mother of the Savior. Mary, who was selected to give birth to a very special child and received this information through heavenly pronouncements, just as Sarah. Mary, who nurtured and raised her son. Mary, who knew many things and pondered them in her heart through the years. Mary, who stood by silently at the crucifixion. Mary, who knows her son will be sacrificed. In this beautiful depiction, the artist Marc Chagall has included Sarah as seen, here, you've got it there, the figure under the tree out to the side. In the distance, Sarah is silently watching or waiting. And up above, we can also see Mary. At the moment the angel stops Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, this view up here above Abraham's head is a view into the future sacrifice of the Son of God, which the Akedah foreshadows. Mary is there, and actually our little arrow has shifted over in the wrong place. Mary is kneeling in front of the cross. You can see her there in grief. The typology is inclusive with types of God the Father, God the Son, and the mother of the Son of God. Sarah must have felt overwhelming anxiety or perhaps some post-traumatic stress following this episode. And in the beginning of the next chapter, Sarah dies and was buried in purchased land that will signify the first land belonging to Abraham and his family in the promised land. As we review these 12 tests of Abraham and Sarah in our minds, we hope that you will remember the tremendous journey they took together, both physically and spiritually in their life. We hope you will hear in your mind the words of instruction Sarah and Abraham received from the Lord, and fill in your hearts the witness of the Spirit of the things they knew and manifested in their lives. The great prophet Isaiah admonished us to emulate as our covenant models both our patriarchal father Abraham and our matriarchal mother Sarah. Ye that follow after righteousness, ye that seek the Lord, look unto the rock whence ye are hewn. Look unto Abraham your father and unto Sarah that bare you. President Nelson has taught that we are all part of their family. He said, God gave Sarai and Abram new names, Sarah and Abraham. The bestowal of those new names marked the beginning of a new life and a new destiny for this family. All who accept the gospel become part of the lineage of Abraham. In Galatians we read, for as many as you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. And if ye be Christ, then ye are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I love the balance that you provided. And I was kind of struck thinking about the Lord's words after Abraham sacrificed Isaac. Now I know. And it reminded me of a couple of other passages of scriptures where women say the same thing after the sacrifice of their children. So you think of in the Book of Mormon, after they send the boys to go to Jerusalem, and Sariah brings that complaint to Lehi, right? But then when they return, she says, "Now I know." There's this assurance, this settling, this sure witness, right? That Lehi's a prophet. In that case, it was interesting because it was God saying that to Abraham. But and then the same thing I think happens with Elijah and the widow when she brings her son back, because she lost her son following the prophet, and she says, "What what do I have to do with thee? Because I've now lost my son." He raises her son, and then she says, "Now I know." And so anyway, I was just thinking about these ideas of the women having this assurance, this sure witness that comes, the sure witness of God, the binding of their covenant with the oath at the end. Anyway, I just throw that out there. If you have any thought or comment on that.
Following the test of faith.
Yeah.
Right? It comes following the test of faith. That's the pattern. And then we know, and then he knows. Yeah. God knows.
Dave and I studied with one of the same professors at the University of Michigan, and actually had him while he was visiting at BYU, David Noel Friedman, and he used to say, who is testing who? Mm-hmm. And I think this fits with what you just said, because sometimes I think the now I know comes from one side or the other. Mm-hmm. And I also think sometimes people have passed the test before the drama happens, and sometimes it isn't until after the drama that they come to realize their faith.
Yeah. Thank you. You brought up Hebrews 11 and the phrasing that Sarah through faith conceived because she trusted in him who promised, right? So what do you, do you feel like that's an intention with the Old Testament narrative? Or, because what does it mean that she conceived by faith or through faith when the Old Testament makes it sound like she's not believing, right? I don't know if that thought on that.
Well, I'll just make a stab at this. I don't really know exactly what it means. We can't imagine how this worked out with the age factor.
Yeah.
But one thing I think we have to consider, and I kind of addressed this at the beginning, was she has a voice, but it's really small compared to all the text. And so we don't really know what was going on in her head. we think of her as not believing because she laughs, she doesn't think she can have a son, she offers Hagar, but if you look at her story, she did all kinds of tremendous faith moves, and we don't hear her talking about it, leaving her home, giving Hagar, just all kinds of things that she's doing, and so the faith may have been much greater than is apparent to us.
Yeah.
That's what I've been thinking.
Well, I think the stories do illustrate she does have faith in God. And that's why it's a trial. Does she have enough faith that it will lead to conception in old age? Mm-hmm. And so I think in the Hebrews passage, some of it relies on the fact that she does have faith in God. And in that case, she will, even though she has some doubts about it, ultimately trust him enough that the miracle can happen.
Thank you. The offering of Isaac as a burnt offering, the question is, what does it mean if the law of Moses had not yet been revealed?
Well, Latter-day Saints reading of the book of Moses suggests that the original sacrifice of the firstborn was probably similar or the same as the burnt offering. So therefore, the sacrifice given to Adam and Eve in similitude of the Savior was practiced by Abraham. And I would deduce that the law of Moses continued that process but added a lot of other sacrifices to that.
Okay, and then a question about just the structure. You both have brought up this 12-point structure for Abraham and Sarah. You divided it in half, right, between their original names and then their name changes. What comment can you make on just the structure as a whole? Like, do you feel like that just kind of happened that way, or do you feel like it's intentional? What is it teaching us? And I guess part of the question is, it's interesting to me that you oftentimes have this duality. So my paper obviously dealt with this original sacrifice followed up by a greater sacrifice. You have Sarai having to give herself to the Pharaoh, then later to Abimelech. So you have that dual. I don't know. So is there anything from the structure that you can make some comment on?
Okay, look, a guy named Casuto believed in reading the Bible text as it stands without sort of some of the critical scholarship that goes with it. And as he did this, it turned into kind of a literary exploration of Genesis. And he discovered that you can find 10 episodes or tests of Abraham along the tradition of the Jewish interpretation, and that they formed a chiasmus, and that therefore these pairs matched up, all right? That was followed by the work of Gary Rensburg that we're going to hear about later today. And he saw that the entire passage of the patriarchal narrative from chapter 11, verse 27, all the way to the end of chapter 25, the episodes line up chiastically, right? But the problem is when you take that structure, Rensburg's structure doesn't match the chiastic pairs of the tests, right? And when you read the 10 tests with Casuto, it's nice and brilliant, but you skip some tests in order to get to the 10, okay? So we just chose in our study today to take them sequentially and find the passages that look best to us to sort of illustrate the idea of testing. But nevertheless, the pairs do exist, like you just mentioned, but they're not chiastic pairs now. They just do match in the narrative. And there's lots more pairs than just the Abimelech, right? The birth of the sons as a pair, right? So that's how we'd answer the structure.
After looking at all the different models, we decided we could choose our own.
Perfect. All right, last question.
And David listened to his wife.
You passed that test? So last question. If Adam and Eve were taught the gospel of Jesus Christ and they taught all their children, then why do you think and how did all the ancient cultures become so male-centric, seeking to only emulate a male god?
We all want to know the answer to that.
Well, one of the questions is why do we continue to be so male-centric, right?
Okay, that's good.
I guess that will get me fired from BYU. I think you have to balance the idea of culture versus doctrine, right? And I think people have to discover the truth in real life, and it does square with doctrine, right? But there's a lot of cultural things that have been heavily influential in managing the lives of men and women that really does overshadow the women. And these documents they lose the voice of these women. We have to read carefully to reconstruct these.
And just think in our own tradition and experience, how it's a slow process that our eyes are open to things that we do in sort of practice and culture that weren't actually part of doctrine or the gospel. And it's very slow for us to go, oh, we can pray, all kinds of things. It's just a slow process.
Thank you. Thanks to the Seeleys.